The Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell that has sent shockwaves through every corner of Britain. Documents that were supposed to remain hidden for 30 years have been exposed. Keir Starmer's government negotiated a secret deal with the European Union that fundamentally betrays British sovereignty. This isn't speculation. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is confirmed by Britain's highest court in a ruling that came down just minutes ago. The implications are absolutely staggering. Everything you were told about Brexit, about British independence, about taking back control, it was all a lie. And now the proof is undeniable. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view British politics forever. Stay with me because this goes deeper and darker than anyone imagined. 1 minute ago, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom released a judgment that has instantly become the most explosive legal ruling in modern British history. The case itself seemed mundane on the surface. A group of backbench MPs had filed a legal challenge demanding access to documents related to post-Brexit negotiations with the European Union. The government fought this request with everything they had. They claimed national security concerns, they invoked executive privilege. They argued that releasing these documents would damage Britain's international relationships and undermine the government's ability to negotiate effectively. For months, the case worked its way through the legal system while Starmer's government did everything possible to keep these documents sealed. But today, the Supreme Court ruled against the government in the most decisive way possible, and the documents they ordered released reveal a conspiracy so vast, so carefully hidden, and so fundamentally treasonous that it makes every previous political scandal look like child's play. Let me be absolutely clear about what these documents prove. While Keir Starmer and his government were publicly claiming that Britain had fully left the European Union and was operating as a completely independent sovereign nation, they were simultaneously negotiating secret agreements that would gradually reintegrate Britain into EU control. We're not talking about minor trade arrangements or cooperative agreements on specific issues. We're talking about systematic commitments that would surrender British decision-making authority back to Brussels across multiple areas of policy. Immigration policy that would effectively restore freedom of movement. Regulatory alignment that would force Britain to adopt EU rules without having any vote on what those rules would be. Financial contributions that would funnel billions of pounds back into EU coffers under different names and through different mechanisms. And most shocking of all, preliminary discussions about rejoining the European Union entirely within the next decade. The British people voted for Brexit. They were told their decision would be respected. They were promised that leaving the European Union meant genuine independence and sovereignty. Millions of citizens participated in that referendum, believing they were making a real choice about their country's future. And now we discover that their vote, their voice, their democratic decision was being systematically undermined by the very people elected to represent them. This isn't just political deception. This is a fundamental betrayal of democracy itself. The government took the people's decision and quietly worked to reverse it while pretending to honour it publicly. They smiled and nodded and spoke about Brexit being done, while simultaneously negotiating away the independence that Brexit was supposed to guarantee. The Supreme Court ruling itself is remarkable for its bluntness. The justices didn't hide behind careful legal language or diplomatic phrasing. They stated clearly that the government's attempts to hide these documents violated fundamental principles of democratic accountability. They wrote that in a functioning democracy, the people have a right to know when their elected officials are making agreements that affect national sovereignty. They explicitly criticised the government's national security claims as exaggerated and designed to hide political embarrassment rather than protect genuine security interests. And they ordered immediate release of not just the documents requested in the original case, but additional related materials that reveal the full scope of these secret negotiations. It was a complete and total judicial rebuke of government secrecy and a powerful statement about the limits of executive power. The timing of this ruling is particularly significant. It comes just weeks after Keir Starmer was forced to resign over different secret agreements that came to light. Many people assumed that scandal was an isolated incident, a one-time lapse in judgment, or a specific mistake made under unique circumstances. But now we see the truth. Starmer's government wasn't occasionally secretive or selectively deceptive. They operated an entire shadow foreign policy designed to hide their real agenda from the British public. The secret deals that forced Starmer out were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And that puzzle, now being assembled before our eyes through these Supreme Court revelations, shows a government that fundamentally did not trust or respect the democratic will of the people they were supposed to serve. Reading through these newly released documents is genuinely shocking. You can see the progression of negotiations over months and years. You can see British officials making commitments and then discussing how to hide those commitments from Parliament and the public. You can see EU representatives expressing confusion about why Britain needed to keep these arrangements secret, since from their perspective, they were simply normal international agreements. You can see Starmer's team debating the political optics and strategising about how to gradually implement these policies without triggering public backlash. The level of calculation, the deliberate deception, the complete contempt for transparency is breathtaking. These aren't officials who made mistakes or used poor judgment. These are people who knew exactly what they were doing and carefully planned how to deceive the nation. One document in particular has already become the focal point of public outrage. It's an internal memo from senior officials in Starmer's government discussing how to manage public opinion around closer EU alignment. The language is clinical and manipulative. They talk about messaging strategies to make EU reintegration seem like a natural evolution rather than a reversal of Brexit. They discuss incremental implementation so that changes happen slowly enough that people won't organise resistance. They debate which policies to hide completely and which ones to present with careful framing that obscures their true nature. And most damning of all, they explicitly acknowledge that if the British people knew the full extent of what was being negotiated, there would be massive political backlash. They knew they were acting against the public will, they knew they were betraying democratic principles, and they did it anyway because they believed they knew better than the voters. The reaction to these revelations has been instantaneous and furious. Social media exploded within minutes of the Supreme Court ruling being published. People who voted for Brexit feel vindicated and enraged. People who opposed Brexit but believe in democratic processes feel betrayed by leaders who claim to represent democratic values. People across the political spectrum are united in outrage at being systematically lied to by their government. Hashtags demanding accountability are trending worldwide. Video clips from the documents are being shared millions of times. And once again, just like during the crisis that brought down Starmer, crowds are beginning to gather in cities across Britain. They're angry, they're organised, and they're demanding answers that go far beyond what any politician seems willing to provide. Parliament is in absolute chaos. Emergency sessions have been called. MPs from all parties are demanding explanations. Even Labour politicians who previously defended Starmer are now distancing themselves as fast as possible, claiming they had no knowledge of these secret EU negotiations. The Conservative opposition is calling for criminal investigations into what they're describing as treason against the British people. Smaller parties are demanding constitutional reforms to prevent this kind of deception from ever happening again. And independents are using this moment to argue that the entire British political system is fundamentally broken and needs to be rebuilt from scratch. The anger isn't limited to one party or one political faction. It's a complete breakdown of trust between the governed and those who govern them. The specific details revealed in these Supreme Court documents get worse the deeper you dig. Britain's new relationship with the European Union was supposed to be based on the trade and cooperation agreement negotiated after Brexit. That agreement was public, debated in Parliament and presented as the framework for future UK-EU relations. But these secret documents reveal an entirely separate set of arrangements that were never disclosed to Parliament or the public. Shadow agreements on regulatory standards that would force British businesses to comply with EU rules. Unofficial commitments on immigration that would gradually restore freedom of movement through a series of exemptions and special provisions. Financial arrangements that would see Britain contributing to EU programmes and budgets through indirect mechanisms that wouldn't appear in official accounts. And perhaps most shocking, preliminary frameworks for Britain to eventually rejoin EU institutions as an associate member with limited voting rights but full obligations. These weren't casual discussions or exploratory conversations. These were formal negotiations with draft legal language, specific timelines, and detailed implementation plans. British negotiators were working with their EU counterparts to create binding agreements that would be implemented through administrative decisions rather than legislation, specifically to avoid parliamentary scrutiny. They developed complex legal structures designed to give the appearance of British independence while gradually transferring actual decision-making power back to Brussels. They created terminology and frameworks that would confuse the public and make it difficult for critics to explain what was actually happening. Every aspect of these arrangements was carefully designed to hide the truth from the British people, while binding them to commitments they never agreed to. The Supreme Court justices clearly understood the magnitude of what they were revealing. Their ruling doesn't just order document release, it includes scathing commentary on government behaviour that is extraordinary for a judicial opinion. They write that democratic government requires informed consent of the governed. They note that secretly negotiating away national sovereignty while claiming to protect it represents a fundamental violation of the democratic compact between citizens and their representatives. They explicitly state that the government's behaviour in this case undermines public trust in democratic institutions. And they warn that if such deception is allowed to continue unchecked, it threatens the very foundation of constitutional democracy in Britain. These are not statements judges make lightly. This is the Supreme Court sending an unmistakable message that something has gone terribly wrong in British governance. Public figures are already weighing in with reactions that reflect the political earthquake this ruling has created. Former Brexit campaigners are calling this the ultimate vindication of their warnings about establishment resistance to genuine independence. They're pointing out that they were labelled conspiracy theorists and dismissed as extremists when they suggested the political establishment would try to reverse Brexit by stealth, and now we have documented proof that's exactly what happened. Remain supporters who accepted the Brexit vote as democratically legitimate are expressing fury that their own side's political leaders undermine democracy rather than working within it. Constitutional scholars are discussing whether these secret agreements might actually be legally void, since they were never properly authorised through democratic processes. And international observers are questioning whether Britain can be trusted as a negotiating partner if its government can make secret deals that contradict its public positions. The Labour Party is experiencing a meltdown that makes their previous crisis look mild by comparison. The acting leader who took over after Starmer's resignation is now being pressured to resign as well, since these secret EU negotiations happened under their watch too. Senior party officials are being accused of complicity in the deception. MPs who claimed ignorance are being challenged by constituents demanding to know how they could have been unaware of such significant negotiations. Party membership is reportedly hemorrhaging as disgusted members tear up their cards and walk away from an organisation they feel has completely betrayed its principles, and internal factions are engaged in vicious fighting over who bears responsibility and how the party can possibly recover from this disaster. Labour isn't just losing political support, it's disintegrating as a coherent political organisation. The European Union's response to these revelations has been notably cautious and carefully worded. EU officials are trying to distance themselves from the scandal while also defending their own conduct during the negotiations. They're claiming that everything they did was transparent on their side and that Britain's internal political decisions about what to disclose to Parliament were not their responsibility. They're emphasising that they never asked for secrecy and would have been happy for these agreements to be public. They're framing themselves as good faith negotiating partners who were simply responding to British government requests. But this careful positioning can't hide the uncomfortable truth that EU officials were actively negotiating arrangements they knew were being hidden from the British public and Parliament. They might not have explicitly demanded secrecy, but they certainly benefited from it and cooperated with it. Financial markets have reacted to these revelations with predictable volatility. The pound dropped sharply as investors processed the implications of this constitutional crisis. British government bonds saw selling pressure as questions arose about political stability. International investors are expressing concern about Britain's reliability as a place to do business when its government operates with such fundamental dishonesty. And economists are warning that regardless of what people think about Brexit or EU membership, this kind of political chaos and governance failure creates uncertainty that damages the economy. Markets don't care about political positions. They care about stability and predictability. And Britain right now offers neither. Legal experts are already discussing potential criminal implications of these secret negotiations. There are laws governing how international agreements must be handled. There are requirements for parliamentary oversight of significant foreign policy decisions. There are regulations about transparency in government operations. And while political misconduct rarely leads to criminal prosecution, the scale of deception revealed in these documents has some legal scholars arguing that this crosses the line from political wrongdoing into actual criminal behaviour. Investigations are being demanded, calls for special prosecutors are growing louder, and while it remains to be seen whether anyone will actually face criminal charges, the mere possibility represents how seriously these revelations are being taken. The documents also reveal fascinating details about internal government debates over these secret EU arrangements. Not everyone in Starmer's government was comfortable with the deception. Some officials raised concerns about the legality and ethics of negotiating secret agreements. Some warned that if these arrangements became public, the political fallout would be catastrophic. Some argued for bringing at least some of the negotiations into the open to maintain democratic legitimacy. But these concerns were consistently overruled by senior leadership who believed that the British public couldn't be trusted to make the right decisions about European relationships. The documents show a clear pattern of elite decision makers convinced of their own superior wisdom and willing to deceive the public for what they saw as the greater good. It's a perfect example of how democratic principles erode when leaders stop trusting the people they serve. The exposure of these secret EU negotiations raises profound questions about British democracy that go far beyond Keir Starmer or any individual politician. If a government can negotiate away national sovereignty in secret while publicly claiming to protect it, what does democracy actually mean? If elected officials can systematically deceive the electorate about fundamental policy directions, what is the purpose of elections? If major international commitments can be made without parliamentary approval or public debate, what is the point of democratic institutions? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're urgent practical concerns about whether British democracy is functioning at all or has become an elaborate theatrical performance, hiding the reality of elite rule without genuine public accountability. The Supreme Court's decision to release these documents represents more than just a legal ruling. It's an institutional check on government power that demonstrates why independent judiciaries matter in democracies. The government used every tool at its disposal to keep these documents hidden. They had the full power of the executive branch. They had teams of lawyers and unlimited resources. They had the ability to classify information and invoke national security. But ultimately, they couldn't override the judiciary's commitment to transparency and democratic accountability. This is the system working as it's supposed to work, with different branches of government checking each other's power and preventing any one institution from operating without oversight. It's a reminder that democracy requires constant vigilance and institutional resistance to government secrecy. Public trust in British political institutions has cratered to levels not seen in modern history. Polling conducted in the hours since the Supreme Court ruling shows unprecedented levels of cynicism and anger toward politicians across all parties. Massive majorities believe that elected officials regularly lie to the public. Overwhelming numbers think that elections don't actually give citizens real control over government policy. Huge percentages express the belief that Britain is run by elites who manipulate democratic processes while pursuing their own agendas. This isn't normal political dissatisfaction or partisan disagreement. This is fundamental alienation from the entire system. And when citizens lose faith that democratic processes work, when they stop believing their voices matter, that's when democracies truly begin to fail. The international implications of these revelations extend well beyond Britain's relationship with the European Union. Other countries are watching closely to see how Britain handles this crisis. Democratic allies are concerned about whether British commitments can be trusted when its government operates with such duplicity. Adversarial nations are using this scandal as propaganda to argue that Western democracy is hypocritical and corrupt. International organisations that rely on British participation are questioning whether they can depend on British follow-through when internal politics are so chaotic. And partners in military alliances like NATO are privately expressing concern about political instability in a country that plays a crucial role in collective security. Britain's credibility on the world stage has been severely damaged, and rebuilding that credibility will take years of consistent, honest governance. The documents reveal something else that has received less attention, but is equally disturbing. The secret EU negotiations weren't just about policy, they were about power and control within British government structures. By keeping these negotiations hidden from Parliament, Starmer's team concentrated foreign policy decision-making in a small group of unelected advisors and senior officials. They deliberately excluded elected MPs from decisions that should have required legislative input. They created a parallel governance structure that operated outside democratic accountability. And they demonstrated that in modern government, the real power often lies not with elected representatives, but with bureaucrats and advisors who operate behind the scenes. This is a pattern seen in democracies worldwide. But these documents provide rare explicit evidence of how it actually works. What happens next will determine whether this moment leads to genuine reform or just another cycle of outrage followed by business as usual. There are calls for constitutional changes to prevent secret agreements in the future, proposals for stronger parliamentary oversight of international negotiations, demands for transparency laws that make government secrecy much harder to maintain, suggestions for citizen oversight mechanisms that give the public direct insight into major policy decisions. These reforms could potentially prevent similar deceptions from happening again, but they require political will to implement. They require leaders who are willing to limit their own power in the interests of democratic accountability. And historically, such reforms rarely happen because the people who have the power to make them are the same people who benefit from the current system. The crowds gathering in British cities are larger than they were during the crisis that brought down Starmer. People understand that this isn't just about one politician's misconduct anymore. This is about a systemic pattern of deception that pervades British governance. They're not just demanding individual resignations, they're demanding structural change. They're calling for a complete overhaul of how government operates and how citizens can hold power accountable. They're unified across traditional political divides because this transcends normal partisan issues. This is about whether Britain is genuinely a democracy or whether that's just a comforting fiction, while elites make all the real decisions behind closed doors.